我是四名唱. Okay, the purpose of this class is to learn how to summarize the story of 左伯桃 and 杨角爱. 我想基本上全用英文授课，所以从现在开始我就基本上再不说汉语了。So before we go on to summarize this story, though, we need to think first about the context in which we might bring up this story with foreign friends. 我们要考虑一下这个故事的背景，以及我们在什么样的场合会跟我们的外国朋友交流的时候会用到这个故事。First of all, we might want to mention this story when having a conversation about the concept of friendship, 就是友谊的概念。Friendship is something we all instinctively understand. 我们本能的知道, but as we get older, we often realize that people use the word friend often to mean a kind of social exchange, 一种社会交换. What do I mean by that? Well, sometimes it can seem that people make friends because they hope to get some benefit from the other person. 他们希望从他人拿到一些好处. However, all cultures have a notion of friendship that's something much more pure, something like the kinds of friendships we made perhaps in primary school when we had no thought of getting any benefit from the other person. In Western culture, for example, the most famous ancient Roman writer, Cicero, 西塞罗, wrote a book called De Amicitia, 友谊论. Now, in that book, he wanted to uphold a pure notion of friendship, 一种纯粹的友谊概念, an idea of friendship based on mutual respect and esteem for each other, 相互尊重对方, without any thought of personal gain, 毫无考虑到个人的利益. So, for example, a conversation with a foreigner might turn to the topic of 关系 in Chinese society. And this is a topic that foreigners are often really, really interested in. If they know any word in Chinese, they'll often know the word 关系, because the rules of relationships, 关系的规则, often work very differently in China from in other countries. Sometimes foreigners believe that friendship in China or in Chinese society is more about business or workplace interactions, 就是业务或者工作场所的互动. So, the story of 左伯桃 and 杨角爱 can be brought up to show that the idea of pure friendship is also something that is an important part of Chinese culture. Okay, so that's an example of the kind of context when this story might be mentioned. 就是说，这个故事可能会在这么一个场合被提到了. So how are we going to try to tell this story quickly and succinctly then? Well, let's start by giving a sentence to frame the story, 就是给我们的故事一个框架. That means to explain why we're telling the story. In China, we have an old story about two friends, which I have always thought evokes a very pure notion of friendship. Okay, well, we're now going to need to give some basic background information, such as this story happened towards the end of the Warring States period, about 2,300 years ago, when China was divided into many small states. Okay, so in that sentence we have given the when and the where of this story. Now we need to introduce our two main characters. This story is about two men, Yang Jiao'ai and 左伯桃, who were travelling to one of the states called Chu in order to work for the king of Chu. Now, we want to set the scene for the main action of the story. The journey was very long and arduous. The weather was also freezing. Okay, just a quick vocabulary point. Arduous means long and difficult. 左伯桃 struggled to keep up with Yang Jiao'ai. He wanted Yang Jiao'ai to go on without him. Okay, so now we need to get to the main dramatic moment of the story. We need to let our audience or listener understand two things. First is the fact that Zuo Botao is weak and lacking in energy. But secondly, that he realizes this fact, 就是他意识到这一点. We also need to let our audience understand the problem of the rice cakes, that there were enough for one of the two of them to continue the journey, but not necessarily enough for both of them to get to the destination in safety. Okay, so how can you put all of this into a few simple sentences? Well, let's try to do it like this. Zuo Botao was running out of energy. He was worried that he would no longer be able to complete the journey. He also worried that he would hold Yang Jiao'ai back and become a burden to him. He also worried that there was only enough food for one of them to make it to the state of Chu. Okay, so now we have set up the situation, and next we need to talk about what decision Zuo Botao made. We also need to explain that he had to make the decision to sacrifice himself without letting Yang Jiao'ai realize. He knew that Yang Jiao'ai will not allow Zuo to sacrifice himself for him. So, let's put it all together in this way. Zuo Botao decided that the best thing to do would be to sacrifice his life for the sake of his friend. He pretended to slip and sent Yang Jiao'ai ahead to look for help. When Yang Jiao'ai returned, Zuo Botao had removed his clothes and was close to dying of cold. He urged Yang Jiao'ai to go on without him. Okay, so that has dealt with the main action of the story. But we need to add information that Yang Jiao'ai valued the friendship so much that much later, when he had the opportunity, he went back to give Zuo Botao a proper burial. So let's add this. Years later, the king of Chu gave Yang Jiao'ai the opportunity to go back, look for his friend's body, and bury him. Yang had kept Zuo Botao in his memory for all these years. Then we should perhaps add a sentence to try to explain the point of this story. I think this story expresses the purest idea that Chinese people have about friendship. A friendship where you are willing to sacrifice yourself for your friend is what we all dream about. We also feel very moved by the fact that Yang Jiao'ai kept the death of Zuo Botao constantly in his mind. Okay, so let's put the whole of this summary together. You'll see it won't take me long to tell it. In China, we have an old story about two friends, which I have always thought evokes a very pure notion of friendship. This story happened towards the end of the Warring States period, about 2,300 years ago, when China was divided into many small states. The story is about two men, Yang Jiao'ai and Zuo Botao, who were traveling to one of the states called Chu in order to work for the king of Chu. The journey was very long and arduous. The weather was also freezing. Zuo Botao struggled to keep up with Yang Jiao'ai. He wanted Yang Jiao'ai to go on without him. Years later, the king of Chu gave Yang Jiao'ai the opportunity to go back, look for his friend's body, and bury him. Yang had kept Zuo Botao in his memory for all those years. I think this story expresses the purest idea that Chinese people have about friendship. A friendship where you are willing to sacrifice yourself for your friend is what we all dream about. We also feel very moved by the fact that Yang Jiao'ai kept the death of Zuo Botao constantly in his mind. Okay, so remember, foreigners are really interested in how Chinese people think about friendship. It's one of those issues that often I think foreigners think that Chinese and Westerners have different ideas about what friendship means. But I think one of the things that this story tells us is that deep down in our minds, whether we're from Europe, America, or China, we all have as an ideal of friendship a kind of common notion that a real friendship is where you actually put the life and well-being of your friend above and beyond your own. As I say, friendships like that are pretty few and far between. We don't often come across them. But I think all cultures have that in their mind as the highest ideal. So, a story definitely worth remembering, a story definitely worth having in your mind that you can bring up in conversation. And I can assure you, when you start getting into deeper conversations with your foreign friends, definitely the issue about friendship, 友谊, 关系, relationships will come up. And it's important that you give your foreign friend a rounded picture of what the Chinese attitude to friendship is. Okay, that's about it for today's class. Bye for now.